How could a 10-story building in St. Louis change the skyline of every major city on Earth? In 1991, a brewer, an engineer, and an architect completed a quiet office tower on Chestnut Street and broke a rule that had governed construction for thousands of years. Before the Wainwright Building, walls held buildings up. After it, they didn't have to. That single shift, steel skeleton over load-bearing stone, reshaped where people work, how cities grow, and what a skyline could even become. But the breakthrough very nearly didn't happen, because by the late 1880s, downtown St. Louis was running out of room in the only direction that mattered. In the late 1880s, St. Louis pulsed with ambition. The city's population surged from 350,518 in 1880 to over 450,000 by the end of the decade, a nearly 30% jump that vaulted it into the ranks of America's largest cities. This boom pressed hard on the city's downtown, where the grid of streets near the Mississippi River became a hive of commerce, banking, and industry. Every block in the central business district was spoken for. Warehouses, insurance firms, and banks crowded together, each vying for the best address and the most visible corner. As trade and manufacturing flourished along the riverfront, the value of land in the city's core crept steadily upward. Developers and business owners faced a simple calculation. There were only so many lots within walking distance of the courthouse, the exchanges, and the new railroad depots. The only way to fit more offices, more workers, and more commerce into the city's heart was to build higher. But the old logic of construction, thick masonry walls supporting every floor, set a practical ceiling on how tall a building could rise. Add another story, and the walls below had to be thicker still, eating up precious space that could otherwise be rented or used. By 1890, the need for vertical expansion was no longer a matter of architectural taste, but an economic necessity. The city's growth had outpaced its physical limits. Downtown St. Louis became a proving ground for new ideas about what a building could be. As parcels grew more valuable and the pressure for rentable space mounted, the city's skyline began to hint at a future where height, once a luxury, would become a requirement. In that crucible of demand and constraint, the ground was quietly being prepared for a breakthrough that would change not just St. Louis, but the shape of cities everywhere. As the city's ambitions pressed upward, architects and builders ran headlong into the hard limits of traditional construction. In a load-bearing masonry building, every additional floor added more weight, demanding thicker and heavier walls at the base. By the time a structure reached 5 or 6 stories, the ground-level walls could be several feet thick, sometimes wider than a man is tall. This wasn't just a technical inconvenience. It was a direct attack on the economics of city life. Each inch of wall carved away rentable floor space, shrinking the very commodity that made downtown land so valuable. The higher a building reached, the more of its footprint was swallowed by brick and stone, leaving narrow, dimly lit interiors and awkward floor plans. Developers faced a grim calculation. The cost of materials and labor surged with every story, yet the payoff, usable office space, dwindled. In Chicago, the Monadnock Building would soon push this system to its breaking point, with base walls 6 feet thick supporting a 16-story tower. But for most cities, including St. Louis, the ceiling came much lower. Above 5 or 6 stories, the old method simply stopped making sense. The dream of a truly tall building was boxed in on all sides by weight, by cost, and by the relentless hunger for space. Height, once a symbol of prestige, became an economic necessity. The city's pulse demanded more room for commerce and industry. Yet the very method that had built the city's past now stood in the way of its future. Masonry could only be stacked so high before it defeated its own purpose. The bottleneck was set. If St. Louis wanted to keep growing upward, something fundamental in the craft of building had to change. Ellis Wainwright was not a typical client. At just 31, he had already transformed the St. Louis Brewing Association into a regional powerhouse, and he wanted a headquarters that would reflect both his ambition and the city's new stature. Wainwright brought the vision and the capital to the table. But he needed architects who could translate economic pressure into something more than just another pile of bricks. For that, he turned to the Chicago partnership of Dankmar Adler and Louis Sullivan. Adler and Sullivan were already making a name for themselves by the late 1880s. Adler, trained as an engineer, had a reputation for solving the practical puzzles of big buildings: how to span wide spaces, how to keep structures light and strong, how to make sure every office had air and sunlight. Sullivan, meanwhile, was the artist and theorist, the one who believed that a building's shape should grow naturally from its purpose, and that modern life demanded a new architectural language. Their partnership was a study in balance. Adler handled the numbers and the nuts and bolts. Sullivan shaped the vision, insisting that a tall building should look tall, its lines and ornament pulling the eye upward. The commission itself was rooted in the fortunes of beer. The St. Louis Brewing Association, led by Wainwright, was flush with profits from the city's booming brewing trade. With competition fierce and civic pride running high, Wainwright saw an office tower as both a business necessity and a public statement. He wanted a building that could stand beside the latest towers of Chicago or New York, but with a character all its own. Adler and Sullivan, eager to prove that their ideas could thrive outside Chicago, took on the challenge. Each figure in this triangle brought something essential. Wainwright supplied the drive and the means, pushing for a building that would make a mark. Adler supplied the engineering muscle, ready to test the limits of steel and space. Sullivan supplied the artistry, determined to craft a skyscraper that was not just tall, but beautiful, an emblem of a city, a business, and a new era in American architecture. Dankmar Adler's engineering mind saw a way out of the brick-and-mortar trap. Instead of stacking story upon story on the shoulders of ever-thickening masonry, he proposed something radical: a hidden skeleton of steel. The Wainwright Building would rise not because its walls were massive, but because a lattice of riveted steel columns and beams carried every ounce of weight. For the first time in St. Louis, the true work of holding up a 10-story office block happened inside the building, in a frame that was both light and strong, fabricated off-site from Bessemer steel, shipped by barge, and assembled piece by piece with red-hot rivets. This new skeleton changed everything. The exterior walls, once burdened with supporting the entire building, were freed to be thin, elegant, and filled with windows. No longer did the base need to swallow up rentable space with thick piers or narrow the upper floors with awkward recesses. The floor plan opened up, daylight poured in, and tenants found themselves in bright, flexible offices that felt nothing like the dim warrens of old. Adler's frame was more than a technical fix. It was a declaration. It meant that height was no longer hostage to the brute weight of brick. The Wainwrights' 10 stories stood on a grid of steel, each column spaced with mathematical precision, each beam locked in place with a shower of sparks. The walls became a skin, terracotta, and brick, expressive and fireproof, but no longer structural. This separation of skeleton and skin gave Sullivan the freedom to shape the building's face, to let the vertical lines soar uninterrupted, and to wrap the whole in ornament that celebrated the building's upward thrust. With its steel skeleton, the Wainwright was not just taller, it was fundamentally new. It was a building that looked and worked like the future, a model for every skyscraper that would follow. In the heart of St. Louis, behind a facade of brick and terracotta, the modern city was being born, one rivet at a time. Steel and elevators arrived together as the silent partners in the new age of tall buildings. By 1990, American steel production had surged to nearly 4.5 million tons a year, thanks in large part to the Bessemer process. This method, first patented in England in 1856, transformed molten iron into durable, uniform steel by blowing air through the liquid metal, burning away impurities. For the first time, beams and columns could be rolled in bulk, cut to size, and shipped by river and rail across the Midwest. The Wainwright Building's skeleton depended on this industrial backbone. Each column and girder was a product of mass production, not artisanal craft. But steel alone could not make a skyscraper profitable. The real breakthrough came when vertical travel became safe, fast, and routine. Elisha Otis's safety elevator, first demonstrated in 1857, had matured into a reliable machine by the 1880s. The Wainwright opened with passenger elevators installed from the start, making every floor as accessible as the lobby. For tenants, the elevator erased the old divide between desirable and undesirable space. Offices on the 8th or 9th floor could now command rents on par with those below, transforming the economics of tall buildings. No longer did upper stories sit vacant or underused. Every square foot became valuable. The pairing of steel and elevator technology did more than solve technical puzzles. It changed the business logic of city life. Developers could now stack offices skyward, confident that people would fill them. Landowners could justify the higher costs of steel framing with higher returns from fully leased upper floors. The Wainwright became a machine for making money, as well as a canvas for architectural ambition. Its frame rose quickly, its elevators ran smoothly, and its upper levels buzzed with activity. In this new world, height was not just possible, it was practical, rentable, and for the first time, truly modern. Louis Sullivan believed that a building's purpose should shape its appearance as surely as a tree's function shapes its branches. He put it plainly, form follows function. For Sullivan, this was not just a slogan, but a demand that the new tall buildings of American cities look like what they were, machines for work, built for the modern age, but also works of art. In his view, the skyscraper should not hide its height behind layers of borrowed styles or heavy ornament. Instead, it should rise honestly, its vertical lines drawing the eye upward, its structure and use written across its face. The Wainwright Building became Sullivan's manifesto in brick, steel, and terracotta. Its tripartite facade, base, shaft, and capital echoes the logic of a classical column, but it is no imitation. The broad sandstone base grounds the building, opening onto the street with wide windows for shops and public life. Above, the shaft stretches skyward in a rhythmic grid of piers and recessed windows, each floor stacked with quiet regularity, each vertical line reinforcing the building's upward thrust. At the top, a deep cornice and a frieze of swirling terracotta leafwork crown the whole, signaling both completion and aspiration. Sullivan's doctrine called for honesty between a building's use, its structure, and its outward image. In the Wainwright, every detail serves that unity. The steel skeleton inside allows the walls to become thin, light, and open to daylight, no longer bearing the burden of height, but instead expressing it. The ornament, drawn from nature but forged in clay, grows organically from the building's bones, not pasted on as afterthought. Richard Longstreth, writing decades later, described the Wainwright as the first office tower where the outside truly reveals the life and logic within. Here, the skyscraper is not disguised as something ancient or foreign. It stands as itself, a new American form for a new American city. In Sullivan's hands, the tall building became more than an engineering feat. It became a deliberate statement about what modern life could look like and how architecture could carry both the weight of commerce and the spirit of invention. The Wainwright Building stands as a lesson in how to read a tall building, not just as a stack of floors, but as a carefully composed object. Its facade is organized into three distinct parts: base, shaft, and crown. This tripartite arrangement borrows the logic of a classical column, but Sullivan and Adler refused to simply copy the past. Instead, they adapted the idea, using modern materials and purpose to create something unmistakably new. At street level, the base is grounded in broad sandstone, its wide windows welcoming the city's bustle inside. Here, the building meets the sidewalk with a sense of stability and civic presence. Above this, the shaft rises in a disciplined rhythm, Vertical brick piers and recessed windows repeat floor after floor, drawing the eye upward in a steady pulse. The facade's lines don't wander, they race skyward, echoing the steel columns hidden just behind the skin. This repetition is not monotony, but clarity. Each floor is legible, each window a mark of the building's inner logic. The shaft's restraint is deliberate, allowing the vertical thrust to dominate and making the building's height feel both natural and inevitable. At the top, a deep cornice and a frieze of terracotta ornament bring the ascent to a close. The crown is no afterthought, it's a declaration. Sullivan's swirling leafwork pressed into clay and fired to a deep red signals both completion and aspiration. The ornament is integrated, not pasted on, and its forms sprout organically from the building's proportions. This is not a disguise for structure, but an extension of it, a final flourish that crowns the climb. The Wainwright's tripartite composition became a model for future skyscrapers. Its base anchors the building in the city, its shaft celebrates the efficiency of the steel frame, and its crown gives the whole a civic dignity. Later towers, from New York to Chicago, would borrow this grammar, finding in Sullivan's design a way to make height not just possible, but meaningful. Terracotta, pressed and fired into panels, wraps the Wainwright Building with a skin that is both protective and poetic. Sullivan's ornament grows across these surfaces in a language of swirling foliage, seed pods and tendrils, motifs drawn from nature but shaped by the hand of an artist attuned to the rhythms of modern life. The spandrels and frieze are alive with detail. Stylized leaves curl and branch. Barley and hop vines nod to the brewing roots of Ellis Wainwright, and every inch of clay seems to breathe with movement. This was more than decoration. Terracotta served as a practical shield, encasing the steel skeleton in a fire-resistant shell that satisfied the city's strict building codes. The panels were light, durable, and easy to shape, allowing Sullivan to design patterns that could be repeated yet never felt mechanical. Karen O'Brien, writing on this ornament, describes the way Sullivan's organic forms create a sense of intimacy at street level, a human scale that softens the bold vertical thrust of the tower. In a building defined by steel and commerce, the ornament insists on beauty. The terracotta does not hide the modern skeleton, it celebrates it, weaving artistry into the fabric of the new city. Each panel, glazed in earthy reds and browns, catches the shifting light, reminding passers-by that progress and artistry can share the same wall. The Wainwright proves that even in an age of industry and speed, a skyscraper can be both a technical achievement and a work of art. Its ornament a bridge between the machinery inside and the life of the street below. In the spring of 1890, the Wainwright Building's lot on Chestnut Street transformed into a stage for a new kind of construction. Steel columns and beams, fabricated to exacting measurements in distant Midwestern mills, arrived by barge along the Mississippi and stacked up in neat rows on the site. Where older buildings had risen slowly, brick by brick, wall upon wall, this project moved with a different energy. The labor force was a mix of seasoned ironworkers and local tradesmen, organized into teams that specialized in the new craft of steel frame erection. Their tools were pneumatic riveters and steam-powered hoists, not just trowels and hammers. Each piece of the skeleton was lifted into place by steam derricks and locked together with red-hot rivets, hammered home by crews working in a syncopated rhythm. The sound of metal striking metal echoed through downtown, a signal that something unprecedented was taking shape. The assembly moved quickly. Floor by floor, the grid of columns and beams climbed skyward, each level completed in a matter of weeks rather than the months demanded by load-bearing masonry. This pace was more than spectacle, it was a practical advantage. The steel frame's precision reduced delays, and the lighter structure meant less time waiting for walls to settle or for mortar to cure. By late 1890, the building's full height was apparent. The skeleton stood exposed for a brief moment, a lattice of steel against the city's skyline, before the brick, sandstone, and terracotta skin began to wrap around it. Inside, Carpenters, plasterers, and elevator mechanics followed close behind the ironworkers, finishing floors, installing Otis passenger elevators, and preparing the offices for tenants. The entire process, from groundbreaking to occupancy, spanned barely a year, a remarkable speed for a 10-story building in that era. This swift rise was not just a testament to industrial efficiency. It showed how the logic of the steel skeleton, the logistics of river transport, and the coordinated effort of skilled labor could turn architectural ambition into reality. The Wainwright Building's construction was as much a product of human ingenuity as it was of new materials, and its very assembly foreshadowed the rapid pace of urban growth that would soon define the modern American city. The Wainwright Building did not slip quietly into the city's routine. From the moment its 10 stories rose above Chestnut Street, it drew the gaze of St. Louis. Newspapers rushed to describe it, their columns filled with praise for what the Globe Democrat called a graceful ascent, a phrase that captured both the building's height and the optimism it seemed to promise. Editorials celebrated the arrival of a true skyscraper, declaring the tower a sign that St. Louis could stand beside Chicago or New York in the race for modernity. The Post-Dispatch called the decorative terracotta a gift to the eyes of a growing metropolis, and pointed to the swirling leafwork as proof that progress need not come at the expense of beauty. But not everyone was convinced. Some readers wrote in to question the wisdom of so many stories stacked above the sidewalk. Cartoonists poked fun, sketching the building's silhouette looming over paddle boats and brick warehouses, asking whether St. Louis truly fancied itself the new Chicago. Skeptics wondered aloud if tenants would really climb so high, never mind that elevators, humming quietly behind the scenes, made the upper floors as accessible as the ground. Yet even the doubters seemed to understand that something new was at stake. The Wainwright was not background real estate. Its very presence was an argument in brick, steel, and terracotta, a public claim that the city's future belonged to the sky. Civic pride swelled around the building. Business leaders pointed to its steel skeleton and modern amenities as proof that St. Louis was ready for the next chapter of American urban life. Office workers boasted of their address, and visitors craned their necks to count the stories. The tower changed expectations for what a downtown office building could be. No longer was height a mere flourish for banks or hotels. Now, it was the rational answer to the city's hunger for space and ambition. The Wainwright became a landmark not just of engineering, but of public imagination, a bold statement that the city's reach would not be limited by tradition or gravity. The Wainwright Building's influence did not pause at the edge of St. Louis. Within a few years of its completion, architects and critics across the country began to treat it as a kind of prototype, a reference point for what a tall building could be. In Chicago, where the steel skeleton had first been tested, the Wainwright's clear vertical lines and tripartite facade offered a new grammar for office towers. Structures like the 1893 Union Trust Building and later, the Carson Peary Scott Store drew directly on its lessons: base, shaft, crown. A steel frame that did the heavy lifting and an exterior that celebrated rather than concealed its upward reach. New York's architects, facing even steeper land values and a relentless push for height, found in the Wainwright a model for how to balance the demands of engineering, economics, and civic pride. The Flatiron Building, completed in 1902, echoed Sullivan's insistence that a skyscraper should look tall and honest, its narrow prow and vertical piers tracing a lineage back to Chestnut Street. The idea that a building's shape should reveal its structure and purpose, what Sullivan called form follows function, became part of the DNA of American skyscraper design. Scholars like Carl Condit and Richard Longstreth would later argue that the Wainwright's true legacy lies in this moment of diffusion. Condit called it the first office tower where the steel skeleton and the facade spoke the same language, and Longstreth pointed to its influence on the so-called Chicago School, a generation of architects who believed that technology and artistry could go hand in hand. The building's tripartite division, its fireproof terracotta skin, and its expressive ornament became touchstones for debate and imitation. Some designers copied its vertical emphasis outright, others pushed back, favoring bulk or historicist detail, but nearly all acknowledged the Wainwright as a model to be studied, adapted, or challenged. The ripple spread outward, shaping skylines from the Midwest to the Atlantic. In the early years of the 20th century, the lessons of St. Louis were visible in the towers rising over LaSalle Street and Broadway, a quiet testament to the power of a single building to change how cities grow upward and how architecture can channel the ambitions of an age. By the middle of the 20th century, the Wainwright Building's future hung in the balance. Urban renewal swept through downtown St. Louis, and the very qualities that once made the building a symbol of progress now left it vulnerable. Proposals for parking garages and modern office blocks threatened to erase the 10-story landmark from the city's map. For many, the Wainwright was just another old structure in the path of change, a relic of a vanished era, outpaced by newer towers and shifting commercial needs. But the building had quietly gathered defenders. Architects, historians, and local citizens began to argue that the Wainwright was not just an office block, but an irreplaceable piece of American architectural history. James K. Leathers, a preservation consultant, assembled the evidence for a National Historic Landmark application in the late 1960s. He gathered original drawings, historic photographs, and expert testimony from scholars like Carl Condit and Richard Longstreth. Their case was simple. The building's steel skeleton and Sullivan's design made it a prototype for the modern skyscraper. Losing it would mean erasing the blueprint for a century of urban architecture. The campaign gained momentum. Margaret H. Lewis, working with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, organized hearings and public advocacy. She pressed city officials to see the building as more than a real estate calculation, framing it as a catalyst for both architectural theory and civic pride. In May 1968, the effort paid off. The Wainwright Building received National Historic Landmark status, a recognition that shielded it from demolition and opened the door for restoration. Attention turned to repair and renewal. The terracotta ornament, battered by decades of weather and neglect, was painstakingly restored. Missing panels were recast using molds taken from surviving originals, and the deep red and brown glazes were matched to Sullivan's palette. The original Otis elevators, once a marvel of modern convenience, were upgraded to meet new safety codes while preserving their historic look. Restoration teams worked floor by floor, reinforcing the steel frame and stabilizing the decorative skin. Today, the Wainwright Building stands as both artifact and living office space. Its survival is a testament to the belief that innovation and beauty are worth protecting. Preservationists point to the building as a turning point in the movement to save America's architectural heritage. It continues to teach architects, students, and visitors about the moment when steel, artistry, and civic ambition joined forces to change the shape of cities. The building's story, once threatened with erasure, now endures, woven into the fabric of St. Louis and the memory of skyscraper design. Today, every glass and steel skyline traces its lineage to a time when a steel skeleton replaced solid walls, Bessemer steel and the safety elevator unlocked new heights, and ornament met innovation. In a world still racing upward, Sullivan's form follows function, and the Wainwright's tripartite elegance remind us that architecture shapes not just our cities, but how we imagine progress itself. The future, like the skyline, remains a work in progress. Thanks for watching.